Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Drag is a type of performance which uses clothing and makeup to imitate and often exaggerate female gender signifiers and gender roles. It's an activity with a long and varied history and continues to be a very popular form of entertainment, as attested by TV shows such as RuPaul's Drag Race. It's also distinctive in having faced criticism from several different political directions, including conservative, transgender and feminist perspectives. In this conversation with Simon Kirchin, Professor of Applied Ethics and Director of the Idea Centre, and someone who has experience as a drag performer himself, we mainly focused on the feminist critique. The problem is that drag typically involves men, i.e. a relatively advantaged group, imitating women, i.e. a relatively disadvantaged group, in a way that plays on often offensive stereotypes about women for entertainment. Described in that way, it seems uncomfortably similar to blackface, a form of entertainment which follows a very similar dynamic, at least superficially, on racial lines. Professor Kirchin thinks a moral difference between these two activities can be identified, though, and in the conversation he explains why. Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Jim.
So we are here to talk about the ethics of drag, and specifically whether drag is harmful or offensive to women. So, well, my first question is, what got you interested in this subject and the ethics of this topic?
Thanks, Jim. So there's probably a few things I can say here. So let's just think about the philosophy, the intellectual dimensions of all this, because drag isn't the normal thing you might expect analytic academic philosophers to be talking about. But I'm genuinely and generally interested in kind of things that many people aren't so interested in. So I've spent the early part of my career working on quite abstract areas of ethics. And now in the middle part of my career, I'm just interested in lots of things that people aren't talking about and interested in the philosophy of them. So perhaps another time we might do a podcast on conflict tourism and heritage ethics. But I'm interested in drag because you might think, well, is there anything to talk about? Well, I think there's lots of philosophical issues to talk about with drag. Just look at what's happening in the news at the moment, where there's controversy, particularly in the United States, but also coming over into other countries such as the UK, where people are offended by drag for various reasons. And that gets me thinking about more general topics. So I've got in mind a general research project you might describe as the ethics of imitation. So you've got one thing, then you've got another thing, and the second thing is like the first thing. Well, what determines that the second thing is like the first thing? And if we're making the second thing like the first thing, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And imitation is kind of all around us. Art and science don't make sense as human activities without imitation. Businesses succeed because they imitate one another. But there's some dark sides to imitation, such as plagiarism, intellectual property theft. And drag's interesting because you've got a case where perhaps a little bit of deception, but really no deception at all. But some people are imitating other people or other styles and ways of being. And some people might find or take offence by that. Indeed, it might be harmful, as we'll come on to. So I'm just interested in the ethical contours of all of this. Then there's a personal comment as well. So over the last few years, I've actually been performing drag. It's not what normally you expect philosophers to say, or at least in the village where I live at the moment, we do lots of amdram, myself, my wife and our family, and we've been big into pantomime. So I performed at the Pantomime Dame for the last few years, very much the drag end of things. So think RuPaul, think Lily Savage, think Danny LaRue, rather than kind of your typical Pantomime Dame. So, and just by doing those performances, I just got interested in thinking about how I was performing and what I was saying.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I guess we'll get a bit later maybe into kind of how one can approach drag performance in different ways. And because I guess one thing to say is that we're kind of asking the question, is drag performance offensive or harmful to women? But the answer might not be yes or no. It might be some forms are and some forms aren't, right? So I wanted to ask you how you're defining drag. So I was interested then, you were talking about drag as imitation. So you do think that drag is a form of imitation?
Well, it can be taken in that way. So I think perhaps as we go through our discussion, this will come out, but I'll say it explicitly at the start. It can be taken as a form of imitation. And if you're framing it in that way, then immediately you get into the kind of criticism that presumably we'll come on to in a moment, where you've got predominantly men imitating women, and that might be a kind of homage, but also it might be a kind of criticism of women and harmful to them. So it can be a kind of imitation, but it's also a kind of expression, right, of the performer's own being. That's a different way of framing what these performances are. So just as a comedian might just be, just telling jokes, expressing their humor and their perspective on the world, and the same of actors in general. So drag performers in various ways might be expressing themselves more than imitating other people. And so there's different ways of framing this interesting activity, and depending on how you frame it, then you might get pathways to different sorts of criticism.
Yeah, because I was thinking about this just by coincidence. I was thinking about what kind of questions to ask you for this topic, and I saw somebody shared a video, somebody I follow on Twitter, or X as it's now named, shared a video of like a drag performer kind of putting on his makeup.
Yes.
I guess his makeup. I don't actually know how to describe him in gender terms, but yeah. And he was saying, well, if you think of this as being me dressing up as a woman, then that's you kind of expressing your own stereotypes of what's male and female and so on. And yeah, so he was trying to frame it as not really being imitating somebody of the opposite sex or gender, but rather just kind of, I don't know, just a kind of...
Yeah, so,
really
goodness,
sure.
we're getting into all the details
Yeah,
already.
sorry.
So shall I just start with what the critics will say, the critics that I'm interested in, then we'll move on to this, because I think the question of, is it imitation, is it expression? I think it can be all those things. That's the broad answer, but perhaps we'll understand it if we get into the criticism. So you might say, well, what am I interested in? Why, about drag being kind of harmful to women? Well, first of all, let's just lay out what I'm not interested in. Well, I mean, I'm interested, but not for the purposes of this podcast and things I'm working on. So you might get certain sorts of groups, let's say Christian groups, conservative groups, who might be offended and think it's harmful for people of one gender, which is kind of clearly delineated, dressing up as and adopting the mannerisms of people of another gender. Right, so I'm not interested in that type of criticism. There's another sort of criticism which you often see, which is kind of more into the kind of area I'm focusing on, but I'm not directly focusing on it. And that's where some people have said, look, drag is an insult or harmful to people who are transgender. And just as a note, there you could possibly mount that sort of criticism, but I think it can be easily discussed and then probably dismissed, at least as a general art form, mainly because so many people who are transgender are now performing as drag artists and are doing so openly. And in fact, if anything, people in the community who might think of themselves as drag artists are very sensitive to and allies of people in the transgender community. And as I say, there are crossovers. So what I'm really interested in is this. So over the last 20, 30, 40 years, there's probably a kind of long heritage, there are people, you might describe them as feminists of a certain sort, cultural critics of a certain sort, who look at drag, and predominantly they're thinking about men dressing up as women. We'll come on to thinking about messing with that in a little while. So think about men dressing up as women, and they think that in various ways, the act of performance, the general art come entertainment type, is an insult to women directly, be it individual women or women in general, and more generally, and perhaps even more powerfully, denies women agency in society. So here's a quotation from a paper by a woman called Kelly Kleiman. I don't know much about Kelly Kleiman. This was in the Chicago Law Review from 2000. She says this: I argue that a whole range of activities, from vaudeville illusionist to the pantomime dame, from Mrs. Doubtfire to Le Cage aux Folles, from cross-dresser balls in Harlem to hasty pudding theatricals at Harvard, represent institutionalized male hostility to women on a spectrum running from prescription of desired behavior to simple ridicule. These performances may be glamorous or comic, presented by gay men or straight men. Nonetheless, all of them represent a continuing insult to women, as is apparent from the parallels between these performances and those of white performers of blackface minstrelsy. And we'll come on to blackface in a little while. So just to warn everyone, we're going to focus on gender performance, but we might be thinking about racial performance later on. So just to draw out those two things from Kelly Kleiman. So there might be a simple ridicule and insult, but also prescription of desired behaviour. There might be a denial of agency. So drag performers performing in certain ways, adopting certain stereotypes, certain mannerisms, and this in some ways limiting what women are expected to be in society. And that's both, society in general, and indeed women themselves might be hemmed in by these various sorts of ways of being portrayed. And that's the main criticism that I'm interested in.
So it's limiting women's agency by kind of being prescriptive about what women should be like. So it's almost saying, here's what women are like. And the thought is that kind of sets boundaries for women's behavior, which is harmful in general.
That's right. So think about some typical standard, perhaps even lazy stereotypes that you might see in a drag performance, like the dumb blonde, the battle axe mother-in-law, the power crazed Amazon, and the other sorts, right? Various pantomime dames of some sort, and so the critics I'm interested in will latch onto those sort of harmful stereotypes and then say, as you say, there's a denial of agency in society in general. These are these kind of categories that women can adopt, and this is how they should be acting in society.
Good, yeah. And then and the other end of the spectrum that was identified in that quote was just insult to women. So is that a separate kind of harm? That's just... you're just insulting women by kind of doing an offensive impression of what you think.
And it might be that you drag performers might be impersonating a particular woman, and they might be doing something through that impersonation that is insulting to them, or they might be, let's say, impersonating a certain sort of woman, let's say a secretary or something else, and they are portraying the secretary as some, let's say, sex mad person. And this itself might deny agency to real life secretaries in the world. Right.
Okay. Yeah. One part of the criticism as well is that drag has been described as a form of punching down.
Yeah.
Right. So it's suggested that drag in some way plays off a difference or assumed difference in social status between men and women. So how does that criticism work? Okay, so,
you could see this as a third criticism, or you could see this as very, very important background to the two I've just mentioned, insulting and denying agency. Because, I don't know what any particular critic of drag would say. I'd hope they wouldn't say that drag is the worst evil in the world, right? But clearly it's not helping, because it's performed against a background where you do have, in many societies, in many cultures, in many eras, men being dominant over women. And so the critics will say, look, we've got these denial of agencies, insults, and they're just cementing the existing power relations rather than freeing things up and trying to criticize those existing power relations in a way they should. So I don't think drag is the worst evil here, but at least the criticism goes, it's not helping very much.
And as you said, one way of making this, I guess, all of these criticisms particularly vivid is by comparing drag to blackface. And that's something that people have done, right? So how does that comparison work? In what ways might one think drag is like blackface?
Yeah. So people have done this quite a lot. And it's not just, say, Kelly Kleiman in that quotation I read out earlier on, and one or two other things I've seen in more kind of academic or popular academic press. But actually you see this on X or Twitter. You see it in all sorts of social media. So the criticism is quite simple. It's just a parallel criticism, right? So we think blackface is just off limits. And particularly people will focus on blackface minstrelsy from the 1800s in America, and then when it went to other countries such as the UK. But they'll also think about all sorts of racial performance, such as yellowface, redface, etc. And the idea is, look, you've got people of one group, normally white Caucasians, normally of European heritage, who will in some way portray people of another race. They'll adopt mannerisms as well as colour their faces. And they're doing this in a way that might be a direct insult to people of that race, but certainly denying agency. So having certain sorts of stereotypes. So in fact, in historic blackface minstrelsy, there were particular roles that were played in touring groups. And this was limiting people's views of people of that race, and it carry on to today. And we think that blackface is completely off the artistic agenda right now. I mean, it just doesn't happen, right? Why? Because it's racist. Well, it looks like everything I've just said about blackface applies to drag, right? Blackface is racist, drag is misogynistic. We don't perform blackface now, so we shouldn't be performing drag either. That's basically the criticism.
Yeah, and that seems like quite a powerful criticism, right? Because, as you say, unless we're going to be in the business of defending blackface, which I strongly assume we're not, we're going to have to find some way in which drag is not like blackface if we want to defend drag. Yeah. Good. Okay, so we've set out what we think the criticisms are. So do you think those criticisms have merit? What do you think?
Okay, so that's an interesting way of phrasing the question. So do I think they have merit? I think that they have. It's very important to think about them and explore them. And just to go back to your first question, so as a philosopher, I'm interested in exploring questions that not many people have thought about. There are one or two articles on drag. There was a collection, a kind of popular academic book a little while ago on RuPaul and philosophy. But otherwise, there isn't that much out there. So I think these are really important questions. They have merit in that sense. I think it's really important to think about them. Indeed, I presented this material in some cases, and there are some people, some academics who think that we shouldn't even be giving these criticisms house room because they seem to be saying drag can't be performed. But this, as we discussed earlier on, this is a kind of perhaps be an expression of some performers, and it's part of an interesting culture and community. Well, then it's kind of like just saying these people shouldn't exist. They shouldn't be doing this sort of thing, which seems essential to them. And I can understand very much that concern, particularly at this moment where you see lots of drag performances being shut down in certain countries, particularly the United States. Even so, as a philosopher, I'm particularly in an academic setting, I'm interested in considering these questions. So I think they have merit. They're understandable to raise. But do I think they go through? No, I don't think they do. So let's review what we've done so far, in fact. So what we're thinking about here is whether the general entertainment come art form of drag, and specifically at the moment we're still thinking about men imitating women or performing as women, whether that general entertainment art form is in some way morally objectionable because it denies agency insults. Well, I think there are some individual performances and individual performers and certain stereotypes and certain ways of performing those stereotypes I think can be insulting and can be used as a vehicle for offence and harm and can be perhaps in some way deny agency to women. I think that's actually true. But does the general entertainment come art form, does that fall just because of these criticisms? No. Because I think there's some positive things you can say in favour of drag as well. So perhaps I'll come on to those. So I started by saying we've got some feminists, cultural critics who are attacking drag. But also there's a very important strain in feminism, in cultural critics, in academic circles that are in favour of drag. And indeed just narrowly think about men imitating women. Because what we're seeing is perhaps two thoughts. First of all, the performance itself. Men impersonating women is actually quite a radical act. It's a radical act now. It's been a radical act through different cultures and eras and history, where you've got people saying, well, actually, this is just dress and mannerisms and makeup. And actually, anyone who wants to can express their femininity. And indeed, it might then get you to think, well, look, women come in all shapes and sizes and do all sorts of things and have all sorts of wants and desires. Perhaps they don't all have to express femininity in this way. And then it might get you to think, well, what is it to be a man and to be masculine? And even if you're quite conservative and think just in terms of two genders, you've got some things to play with that drag is drawing attention to. But then beyond that, you might well start thinking about gender, right? Is it a bit more fluid than we might think? And there's various other things to say here, but the key thing is, whereas feminists, cultural critics might be worried about women being offended and denying agency, some people say drag is actually quite liberating because it draws attention to gender and these categories which might be oppressive and should be getting us to think more liberally in a progressive way about them. That's one big strain of thought. And then there's a second one, which is it's not just any old performer. If you look at the social and political history of drag in various cultures, and not just the current kind of modern moment we're experiencing in various parts of the West, but in various intersex communities in all parts of the world, third sex communities, then you've got an issue where perhaps marginalised people in various ways, marginalised from the norms in culture, are typically drawn to drag and performing it. So drag is not just a performance art, it's coming out of a community and reflecting a community, which is often kind of people on the margins. And that itself is very important to the artistic expression.
Right.
So people are saying, look, this is an expression of a kind of marginalised group that's trying to shout out and say, look at us, we're important, broadly.
Hello, this is just a brief interruption to tell you about an event that IDEA the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds is hosting as part of its 20th anniversary celebrations this year. We're delighted to be welcoming Gavin Esler, journalist, presenter and author, to present a public lecture, Dead Cats, Strategic Lying and Truth Decay, on the evening of Tuesday, 17th of June, at Clothall Court in Leeds. Gavin is an award-winning journalist, broadcaster and author. He's best known for presenting the BBC's flagship Newsnight programme. He also spent a number of years as the BBC's chief North American correspondent, as well as reporting in other countries. He's the author of 5 novels and 4 non-fiction books commenting on politics in the modern world. Drawing on his recent book, Britain is Better Than This, Gavin will analyse the state of current politics and truth-telling in the public realm. He will argue that people no longer trust businesses or politicians or journalists as much as they used to, and that this is the result of what he calls the politics of distraction. He will discuss how a loss of trust and truth decay is eating away some of the core principles of democracy in the United Kingdom, the United States, and elsewhere, and will suggest how trust and truth can be reinforced. You can book your place at the event by going to our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics and clicking on the link to find out about our 20th anniversary events. We'll also put a link in the show notes for this podcast. Thanks. Now back to the interview. Okay, so going to take the first of those points first. You're saying that there's a sense in which drag has the potential to kind of break down barriers between genders, right? And that, I suppose that answers the original criticism, if it's true, because the criticism is that it's a kind of patriarchal performance whereby members of one gender are stereotyping, caricaturing and insulting members of the other.
That's right.
Of another gender. And the suggestion is that that's not really quite what's going on here, that there's a kind of more of a sort of fluid interplay between the genders going on. And I suppose that would make it different from the blackface case, where there's nothing really like that going on with blackface. It is just more straightforwardly an insulting caricature by one race of another.
That's right. There's some other things to say about blackface, which we'll come on to, but yeah, it's important to the blackface case as well.
Yeah. Okay, good. And then the second point is a kind of historical point. So it's sort of saying, just as a matter of fact, if you look at the actual origins of drag, it's not coming from kind of people in positions of power, right? It's coming from people who are themselves marginalized, and it's an expression of their. So how exactly does that work? Like, I'd just be interested if you could say a bit more about that. Like, you said it was kind of, it's an expression of themselves in some way, and it's kind of empowering.
So let's go back to criticism. I mean, you use the word patriarchy, which is the first time I think we've used it. I've studiously avoided it so far. So it's fine. It's good to introduce it. So patriarchy is you've got men in power, and they're the patriarchs, and they're determining in some way, either explicitly or just implicitly, carrying on a tradition that men carry on being in positions of power and having an undue, inappropriately weighted influence in society. There's various ways to sharpen that. That's broadly what we mean here. And so what you've got is the assumption is you've got men dressing as women. Now, Kelly Kleinman says it could be gay men or straight men, but actually that glosses over the fact that at many points in society, in different cultures and eras, gay men have been marginalised, and indeed drag performers have been even more marginalised. And as I say, you've got very interesting kind of not just history, but kind of modern times where you've got in various parts of the world, India, various parts of Central America, Latin America, other parts of the Far East, where you've got third sex, intersex communities, right, who in some way perform some sort of interesting social role or just living their lives. They might take part, they're kind of quasi-performers. They might take part in rituals or carnivals that happen every so often, but they're not straight out and out performers, right? They're just living their life and they're just accepted in the community. And so drag is kind of in some way fluid with these sorts of expressions and ways of living as well. And all of these are challenges to a kind of patriarchy where you've got dominant, often white men who are determining what's going on. Actually, what drag opens up for us is there's lots of different ways of living and different ways of organising society. Now, in a way, that's the thought. You might blow that up too much, I think. So I think as a kind of referee to some extent in this debate where I'm drawing on these kind of two traditions in feminism and cultural criticism, I think that possibly they're putting too much weight on drag, even though drag is kind of all out there at the moment. We're living in a golden age of performance. There's far more big things going on here than drag. It's not the biggest evil. It's not the biggest good in the world. But even so, there are some interesting things where drag can either cement some difficulties, but also release us and kind of show there's kind of more liberal, progressive thoughts going on here of the sort that many feminists should be interested in.
Yeah. One of the things that I found really convincing in your paper, there was a quotation, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was from, but somebody talking about, I guess, gay drag performers and talking about the way quite often it's a sort of, it's kind of taking the thing, some part of one's identity, which is kind of part of the reason why one is marginalized in the first place, and sort of making that into this loud, powerful expression of oneself, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of taking the thing that people want to hurt you for and making it part of your kind of armor.
Yeah, good. And I think that's from Dominic Scudera, who's a theatre and drama academic and part-time drag performer. Yeah, and in fact, he says that in relation to, as many drag performers do, they will often have had powerful women in their lives when they were growing up, and they're doing it not just to express themselves, but to give people, perhaps people they knew, kind of a voice and to make them big and bold. And that's often an inspiration that many drag performers will have. I think something to say is that there's this expression, whether they're successful or not is another matter. Philosophers will often say, well, your intent might be this, but what's the effect? And we might want to distinguish between those two things. But clearly many drag performers say a lot about their inspiration and their intent behind their performance. And their intent behind performance is definitely not to offend or harm women. It might be to offend perhaps the patriarchy and conservative critics, but that's a very different sort of intent.
Yes. And the other thing that is worth mentioning is kind of what the response of audiences to drag performances is like, right? So just as a kind of, I mean, this is completely purely anecdotal, right? So I don't have any research to back this up, but my kind of sense is that some of the people who are most kind of enthusiastic about, and respond well to drag performances tend to be women, right? It tends to be that they find it extremely entertaining. There's a kind of sense of liberation of watching drag performers, whereas men, or at least kind of straight men, again, sort of anecdotally or stereotypically, might just be made to feel uncomfortable by that kind of performance. Whereas if it was going to be the kind of patriarchal performance that people have in mind, you would expect that to be the other way around, right? You would expect women to be, uncomfortable, and you would expect straight men perhaps to be more entertained by it.
Yeah. So I think on the first one about women liking drag, that's definitely my experience of just doing kind of am-dram, but also, being an avid watcher of drag and reader of culture and so on. That's certainly true. I think you're right. When it comes to men, you would have been right a few years ago. I think because there are so many drag performers popping up in all sorts of places, but I think that's changing as well. I mean, I think there are still some men, indeed some women, who might be uncomfortable with it, but I think many men are kind of happy with it now.
Another point that you make is that, so far we've really just been talking about men dressing up as women, or men, wearing stereotypically women's clothes and acting in potentially stereotypical ways in apparent imitation of women. But it's not all about that, right? That it happens the other way around, and there are even actually female drag queens, right? So women who perform as drag queens.
Yeah. So let's, in a way, all of this has been part one, right? So you've got to think the critics are just interested in men dressing as women, although there are one or two points where they talk about women dressing as men. So in fact, Kelly Kleiman, who I read out quotation from earlier on, she wrote that paper in 2000, which is a lifetime in artistic circles, lifetime in academia. And she does mention women dressing as men, but she thinks that this is all to be applauded because it's not, as we might say as philosophers, symmetrical, right? There's an asymmetry here because women are kind of punching up. They're punching up against the patriarchy. But even so, many of the critics aren't thinking about different sorts of drag performances. So you're right. We have been thinking about focusing on men dressing as women. So let's move into part two. Right? Because drag performance has exploded. We've got this golden age of performance where drag is all over the place. I mean, in one sense, it's kind of a bit boring, right? You want to advertise a chocolate bar, you want to attract people's attention, let's get a drag queen to do it, and I'm sure there'll be a moment where it will be very passé. I'm sure there are some people who criticize drag because they're bored with it because of that overexposure. But even so, I think there's something very artistically happening as well as more media profile for drag performers in many countries. And what we're seeing is men dressing as women, which has always been the case. There's always been a minority of women dressing as men, a minority of drag performers. And in fact, if there is a criticism here, it's that hasn't been a kind of equal opportunity. But that's growing. And as you say, there are some women who perform as drag queens, right? And that's an interesting category to think about, right? So how on earth does that work, right? Surely they're just women performing as women, right? Well, there are quite a few women who perform as drag queens. There are a few women who've been on RuPaul's Drag Race. And what they're doing is taking on exaggerated performances of stereotypical women, like imagine huge amounts of makeup, wigs, costume, exaggerated mannerisms, and so on and so forth, right? And there's lots more I can say about that, but we've just given you three categories, everyone. Well, then there's a fourth category and then other things we might want to do. The fourth category, I'm just going to kind of hold on for a bit, right? Men performing as drag kings. Okay, let's just think about that. Well, I'm just going to put that on the table and we'll come back to it. And then there's this sort of thought, right? Because at the moment, what we've got just playing around with two genders, men, women, right? Men performing as men performing as women, and then the contraries as well. But actually what drag is doing, and has done for a while, but at the moment is very artistically rich. where you've got people who might be identify as one gender, just adopting very stylish wigs, makeup, costumes, and just, having exaggerated performances and not really trying to perform as people of a particular gender, right? And then you've got people who might be themselves in their lives, think of themselves as non-binary or no gender or whatever you might term it, and then performing as people of a certain gender, or again, just adopting kind of outlandish makeup and costume and style. And so we've seen actually the drag community, or definition of drag, change as people's artistic ambitions have changed, and this expression of who they are, and this being lapped up by quite a lot of audiences, right? So you've moved from men dressing as women to a whole range of different drag performances, people who are self-identify and are included within a very larger drag community. And that should get you to think about what we mean by drag. Okay, so let's just think about female drag kings. What are female drag kings? Well, like their male drag queen counterparts, as women adopting styles, outlandish dress of men, and so they might be dressing with beards and big pecs and muscles in business suits and adopting certain stereotypes such as the businessman or the politician or the academic, who knows. And then you've got particular imitations of certain individuals. So just as you might get male drag queens dressing as Marilyn Monroe or Taylor Swift, then you might get female drag kings dressing as Donald Trump or Elvis Presley, right? So then let's think about this interesting category of male drag kings, right? Because you might think, male drag kings, you don't see many of them around, right? Actually in drag clubs or on RuPaul's Drag Race or anything like that. So you might think, well, actually that's a possible but empty category, right? Possibly, but on the other hand, it's a very, very full category, right? So think about typical comedians or actors performing in certain sorts of stereotypes. So my favorite example here is the Two Ronnies, which will appeal to people of a certain generation, but not others. So Two Ronnies were very, very popular entertainers in the 70s and 80s in the UK, and they were big news. They had a very, very highly watched program on Saturday evenings, mixture of comedy, songs, and so on, and they got a pedigree as comic actors. And every week in the series, they used to do a kind of series of parody songs where they would adopt two personae, two sort of roles of various sorts. And so some weeks they might be women from a women's institute or women in a typical Sunday congregation, and they would play around with lyrics and sing traditional hymns or songs or something. But some weeks they might be kind of Welsh miners or bin men or whatever else. And there you can say of the two Ronnies, Ronnie Corbett and Ronnie Barker, well, perhaps they're doing a type of drag when they're dressing up as women. Well, actually, they're doing something pretty much the same when they're bin men or people, men in a Welsh male voice choir, but they just happen to be men, right? So once you start thinking like that, you can think about all sorts of comedians and actors adopting all sorts of stereotypes in certain ways. And then you've got a whole range of male drag kings. Whether you give them that label or not isn't the matter, but they're doing something that looks exactly the same as going on with other sorts of drag performance. And the kind of conclusion of all of this is, well, we've started with this quite narrow version of what drag is, men imitating women, or there being an imitation, right, of a certain sort of style of dress and stereotypes and whatever else. But actually drag is a kind of expression where you're just kind of acting and just doing theatre, right? And actually drag can be very artistically rich. And really you've got these drag performers just adopting outlandish clothes, makeup, style of any sort of gender or any sort of stereotype, right? And so when you've got criticisms going on that drag is morally objectionable because it harms women, perhaps the problem here is a general problem within art, right? It's not that what's problematic is drag. What's problematic is stereotypes or harmful uses of stereotypes. So drag can obviously have individual instances where a performer might be using harmful stereotypes, right? But also it can be liberating. But that's true of any sort of theatrical performance where you can go to a kind of, watch a play in your local theatre and you see a kind of not a very good play. Why is it not very good? Because the writer and the actors are just got quite harmful, quite conservative stereotypes.
Right. Isn't it the case that if we're going to be able to separate drag performance from just any other kind of performance where someone's wearing a costume, the definition that we're going to use is going to have something to do with gender stereotypes, right? Because otherwise, like any instance of a comedian, for example, dressing up in a costume is going to be a drag performance. And that seems maybe a bit too...
That's right. So what I've just introduced is something that's incredibly liberal, right? As you say, any sort of drag could be any sort of dressing up. And it's not quite that, right? Because there's clearly a tradition here. And to make sense of an art form, you need to think about the history and the tradition. So... sorry, the way you came in before I was going to the last bit. So you might want to kind of immediately say, but it can't be that liberal, our definition. And I think that's probably right. But where that boundary is and how porous that boundary is, I think is really up for grab. The critics are dealing with quite a narrowly defined boundary. But once you think about things that not just thought about and classed as drag nowadays, but actually go back in history, you'll find that there's a lot more of interest within the drag label than you might typically find as critics. And then that starts getting you to ask questions of, well, is it drag itself that's problematic, or is it particular forms of drag where they're using stereotypes, right? In which case you're just saying that the criticism becomes this: those types of drag that employ harmful stereotypes are harmful, right? Well, we knew that already, just from the definition.
Well, did we though? Because it kind of occurs to me that they're actually the drag performances that use harmful stereotypes, which might not be the same as kind of supporting those stereotypes or sort of playing into those stereotypes. I mean, that's very commonly what drag performance is doing, and actually it's part of what makes drag fun. So do we want to say that drag can't use stereotypes at all, because that seems like that's going to be very limiting in terms of...
So I don't want to say that. So I think so here's another thought I have about stereotypes and art in general. I think stereotypes are fab, right? And I think going back kind of 5 minutes, that theatrical production, that play, which uses quite conservative and narrow stereotypes, which is what makes the performance unsatisfying, is because they're using stereotypes in a really kind of artistically dull way, and perhaps that's morally bad way as well. Whereas in fact there are loads of cases of art using stereotypes and playing on stereotypes to actually do something very artistically interesting and indeed morally important as well. And the same's true of drag, right? So I think drag does employ stereotypes, not exclusively though, right? But they can do it in some really, really interesting ways, in a way that liberates, that draws attention to the stereotype and then might criticize it in a way that the arts can. So I don't think that, so when I say art's using harmful stereotypes and then it becomes art, that it becomes harmful, as that formula I had just a little moment ago, perhaps that just needs a little bit of sharpening. That's certainly true. I'm thinking about the harmful employment of those stereotypes rather than the stereotypes themselves being necessarily harmful.
Yes, yeah, good, okay. Ultimately, we seem to have arrived at a position where we're saying you can't just dismiss drag as being morally objectionable in general, right? But you also don't want to say that any form of drag is automatically not morally objectionable. So you want to say that there are certain ways of doing drag which might be offensive and which we might want to avoid, but there are other ways which are going to be constructive and imaginative and useful.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I've seen some harmful performances or some offensive ones which are very offensive. I think I should say this as well. So we can criticize a particular performance, indeed a particular performer, particular persona or stereotypes on an individual level. I mean, I have some research projects with some comedians thinking about free speech and exploring philosophy of comedy. And one thing I'm exploring with them is we want comedy to be out there and be an expression of freedom of speech. I think it's one of the most interesting areas to think about at the moment with freedom of speech. But we also need to be kind of quite charitable to comedians, because often they'll be trying out material. And the best way to try out material is often in front of a live audience of people you don't know. And sometimes they're experimenting, right? And sometimes they're experimenting with material that is just a bit off and they have to kind of pull it back. Sometimes they're experimenting with material and they've thought about it a lot, but they're getting the wrong laugh from the audience. And so some comedians who drop those jokes because they're getting the wrong laugh. So I think that it's one thing to say that and drag performers are, I think, in the same boat, right? So they might not quite know how performance is and what a performance is until they've been in front of a live audience for a few times. So it might be one thing to criticize the performance, another thing to criticize the drag performer who might be doing something in good faith. So that's just an interesting footnote on that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And how does that relate to the criticism about blackface then? We said we'd get back to this suggestion that drag is analogous to blackface. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, so I think, going back to your earlier question about whether this criticism has merit, I think this has real merit. I think it's really important for us as philosophers and indeed just people, right, to think about this, because we've reached a point where we think drag as a general artistic art form can be perfectly fine, but there are some worrying aspects to individual examples. We don't want to say the same about blackface. So here I hope people understand what I'm doing here. I'm kind of exploring the issue of blackface. I mean, I think that there are some interesting philosophical papers that have come out recently exploring and leading on from the history of blackface, where I think I'm not about to say blackface is fine before anyone, and Jim's going to leave this in the edits, right? I'm not saying that, but there's some interesting. Once you look at the history of blackface, you realise that, like any big cultural artistic phenomenon, it wasn't all bad, right? So, for example, it was the only. For some people, it was the only way they could earn money, right? It was also used by some marginalized groups to give voice to what they want to do, not just black people. Actually, there were some interestingly Jewish people who were marginalized in certain societies who were able to give expression to their artistic talents. And there's all sorts of things like that. But clearly, overall, predominantly, right, blackface emerged because of slavery in the US, and it carried on and it cemented people, not just slavery, but people's attitudes towards people of a certain race, and carries on to today. So it was clearly a horrible, morally heinous activity, right? But so how is drag, which you might refer to as woman face, right, different from minstrelsy, which you might refer to as blackface? So there's various things you might do. So you mentioned earlier on, like the function it might have and people's attitudes, and the fact that there might be this lack of expression. And that's one way to think about the differences here, how they might be disanalogous. One thing that I'm interested in is thinking about the history. So I'm a big believer in this thought, that you can only understand an art form if you think about the history of how the art form emerged. I don't think that's the only way to understand it. There's other things to bring in, its function, how it's appreciated by an audience, but history is one important thing to understand an art form, how it emerged, and therefore what modern versions of this art form are, right? And so clearly the history of blackface is one that's morally heinous and terrible, right? It emerges from US slavery and helps to cement some of that slavery and those racial attitudes. Whereas drag, in many different eras and cultures, has a very different history. So I go back again to, normally it emerges from marginalized groups, people who don't have much power. And then you have those people who are expressing themselves and giving voice to themselves and, entertaining themselves as a community, and then it seeps out into the larger community as well. And often you find that people from this marginalized community will seek common cause from people of other marginalized communities. So the classic example here is 1960s America, where you had people, obviously you had the civil rights movement, which was a range of different movements, right? The black community, gay community, to take the two most obvious ones. And you had people from the gay community, and particularly drag gay men in the drag community performing and seeking common cause from people in the black community. Didn't always work because at those times there were attitudes, I think it's fair to say, where there were some gay people who would have had racial prejudices, and indeed some people in the black community would have had homophobic prejudices as well. But there was some meeting of minds from some people where they were seeking, you have these two groups who are marginalised who are seeking a common cause. And that's often the history of what you find with people in these communities where drag comes out as an expression, both in history and indeed in modern times. So immediately you can say, in order to understand drag, and in fact, not to have this very liberal idea of drag or any sort of dressing up, as you rightly picked up on earlier on, but kind of trying to delineate it, you kind of think about the history of it. And frankly, the history of drag is quite different from the history of black and white minstrelsy. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Whatever nuances you might put on them and bits of the historical record, they're different. And that itself tells you that there's something quite different about modern art forms, right? Drag is kind of more progressive, more on the side of the angels, more kind of trying to say there's marginalized groups here, let's celebrate what they can bring to society in different ways. And where you've got anyone standing up black and white minstrelsy, you're swimming against a huge moral tide of this was a terrible thing that came out of a terrible period in history, right? And so there's a clear difference there. Unless you understand that, you're not understanding what these art forms are. Because it's not that no one is saying that there's something morally bad just about putting on a certain colour of face paint, right? I mean, if that's the criticism, that's a weird criticism, as if black face paint was bad and blue face paint was okay. That's weird, right? It's an artistic expression of sort of a way of portraying people. And simply no one's saying there's anything, apart from if you're a conservative Christian, say, about a man putting on lipstick. It's the performance and what's behind it. So you understand the artistic art forms by looking at the history, and the histories are radically different.
Great. Good news for drag performers then. I think that's just about all we've got time for. So, Simon Kirchin, thank you for being on the podcast.
And thanks for having me, Jim. It's great.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.